I'm Christian Larange. I'm here to talk to you today about the G3300 from EnviroFit International. And I'll be talking to you about how to unpack the stove and the best way to burn it. When you first get the stove, when you open it up here, first thing you'll see on top is the fuel grate. It's important that you always keep this with the stove. It really helps with the burning of the stove. From that, you can take the entire stove out of the box. Bundled together, we have the ceramic, which goes on the very bottom of the stove, and then your fuel grate. You want to be careful when unpacking the ceramic because it is the most fragile part of your stove. What you see here is the inside fuel grate. This is what supports the fuel, keeping it off the bottom so you can get a more complete combustion. And your stove is ready to use. With your stove, you'll also find a warranty information and a user's manual about how to use your EnviroFit G3300. So we have the stone set here on a fire brick just to protect underneath. Now this stove will get hot after you've been burning it for a while, so you may want to think about putting it on something if you're afraid of damaging anything that's underneath. EnviroFit has worked very hard to have a very safe stove that can be used in the home, but you do want to make sure that you're watching out for children and things like that around because there is a risk of burning. This stove is designed to be burning biomass fuels like wood, things like that. You want to try and use dry fuel if at all possible because you get the most complete combustion and the cleanest emissions, which is always good for the health. Now I'm going to be starting this stove with a little bit of paper. You can also do it with kindling or liquid fuels like kerosene. If you are using kerosene, you only need to use a small capful. If you use kerosene, it is going to be smoky when it first starts up, and you really don't need too much. So just make sure that you limit how much kerosene you use. So just loading it with small pieces to start here. You don't need to overfeed the stove. It will light very easily, and it uses a very little amount of fuel when you're actually burning, so don't worry about overfilling the stove. When you first start the stove up, you will see a little bit of smoke coming out of it. Once the fire is going, you should see very little visible smoke being released. To get going, you can start to move to a little bit larger pieces. Once it's fully going, you only need 3 or 4 pieces of fuel in here to keep it going. You want to make sure that you leave a little space between the fuel so that it gets enough airflow so each of the sticks can burn completely. You actually want to keep the fuel off the back of the stove a little bit so you can get air coming past the fuel and coming up the back side. It's going to help with your combustion and going to reduce the emissions being released out. It's also important to realize that you don't put fuel underneath. The fuel is going on top of this fuel grate here, not underneath. Again, that allows air to come underneath to get a lot more complete combustion. As your fuel starts to burn, you're going to have ash and coals developing on the back of your sticks. You can just bang those against the back of the stove and on the fuel grate to knock those off, and then feed your fuel a little bit farther in. You want to try and keep the flaming pieces of wood towards the back of the stove, so not only do you get the most heat making it to your pot, but that you don't have fire creeping out the front of your stove. If you're using larger pieces of fuel, this outside fuel grate can be moved out so that a larger piece of fuel can be put into the stove without it falling down. Now that you have your stove going, you're ready to start your cooking process. Depending on what you're wanting to do with your stove, you can either have high or low power. You affect that by how much fuel you put in. If you want to have a high power sort of setting where you're boiling water, you're going to add more fuel. If you want lower power where you're going to simmer something for a long time, you can reduce the amount of fuel you use and you'll still have the stove work effectively. It's important to realize the stove will get hot, so you don't want to be moving this stove not only when you're cooking, but for a little while afterwards. The handles will get warm, the front of the stove will get hot, So you just want to be careful while you're using it. Again, EnviroFit has tried very hard to make the stove very, very safe for the user, but there will be parts of the stove that get hot. When you're done cooking, what you need to do is put out all your fuel. Now, there's different ways to do that. What I'm going to show you is how you take it out and you can just put it into a bucket, close off the air, and the fuel will go out on its own. Just set that aside, let it cool, and you'll be okay. It's really easy to clean the stove. You can just remove the fuel grates. Again, be careful, this fuel grate is very, very hot. And using a stick or a spoon or something like that, you can just scoop out these ashes. You want to make sure you remove all the ashes and coals before you cook again to make sure you have the right airflow going underneath the fuel grate. Now the stove will stay hot for quite a while, so you want to make sure you don't try and clean your stove with water or something like that. It's not only may you hurt yourself, but you may damage the stove. The stove body will stay warm for about half an hour, but the combustion chamber can stay warm for up to an hour. All you really need to do to clean it is wipe it down. Again, you want to make sure the stove is cool before you do this, but you can just take a cloth, wipe down the top, the sides, the mouth, and then you can wipe out inside the combustion chamber. Your stove is ready for its next use.